You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy.
Get rocking then. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Action Design Radio. I am Erik Johnson here in lovely Chicago, Illinois, and I'm joined with my co-host as always, Zarak Khan. And Zarak, to play into our kind of typical tradition here, where in the world are you right now?
Well, thank you for asking, Erik. I am actually in Durham, North Carolina. So, if anyone guessed Durham, North Carolina, you get a free pint of beer from Full Steam Brewery.
What a treat.
However, I do have a little bit of fun news to share since one update since our intro podcast all those many months ago, which is that I have a new job. So in the future, you will maybe hear Where in the World is Zarak might be in St. Louis more often because I'm now Behavioral Innovation Director at a company called Merits, which we'll probably talk about, I don't know, at some point in the future because there's a lot of cool people doing interesting behavioral stuff there that we might even bring on as a guest to chat about the cool work that we do. But
nice tease for future episodes.
That's right, yes. So stay in your seats or wherever it is that you listen to podcasts for future fun behavioral stuff.
Cool. Well, congratulations on the new position, Zarak, and we're excited to have some more people from the Merits team on the podcast soon as well. So a round of applause, everyone, whether you're in your car or on the subway, wherever you are, a loud cheer is definitely in order. And you can keep cheering because we can also introduce our exciting guest for this week, which is our good friend in the behavioral space, Linnea Gandhi, who is also here in Chicago, at least right now, but is mostly here. And she's the founder of BehavioralSight, which is a boutique behavioral consulting firm, I think is a good way to put it. So, Linnea, thank you so much for joining us. I think the kind of easiest and best way for us to start with is to give a much better introduction to yourself than I can give and tell us a little bit about who you are, a little bit of your background in the fields, and kind of what you're working on right now.
Sure, absolutely. Congrats on the new position, Zarak. It's exciting. So I call myself an applied behavioral scientist of sorts. I have a foot in the real world, actually that's where I spend most of my time, working with companies to apply insights and methodologies from the field of behavioral science. And I also spend some of my time teaching it at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business to MBA students, again, focusing on the applied nature of it. So I think you asked a little bit about background. That's probably a good way of describing what I mean by applied behavioral scientist. Mm-hmm. I got into the field most intensely when I was doing my MBA program at Booth. Very early on, I fell in love with the topics that were introduced in the MBA courses around behavioral science, so how to manage teams and be a good leader and think about framing. And I started taking PhD courses in it more and more rather than my actual MBA courses, and seriously considered getting a PhD and becoming a behavioral scientist in full. But I kept getting the same feedback over and over again that the research proposals I was developing were applied. They were too applied, which is a bit of a dirty word if you're in psychology.
Too applied.
Too applied. Not theoretically interesting enough, which is, it doesn't have to be a dichotomy. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but sometimes it is, and sometimes it's conflated to be a dichotomy. So what that feedback meant was I was more interested in research that had outcome variables in the real world, that took a cool paper that I had read from usually a psychologist in one of my classes and extrapolated it to a real world setting, such as how people recruit at Booth, and something that I saw my fellow students doing all the time, or, how you can get teams to work better in an actual company rather than a study being conducted in a lab. Now that like mostly field research. So I was really interested in going into the field. I wasn't paying a lot of attention though to the mechanism involved. So I would extrapolate the mechanism or the theory from the lab paper and assume that that was what was going on in the real world. But it didn't matter to me so much to fully perfectly isolate that that theory was what would be driving the behavior in the real world. Does that kind of make sense? Like to be a real researcher in behavioral science, to be a great academic, you know, it certainly would be great to be looking at outcomes, but a lot of what's rewarded is to very clearly isolate the mechanism involved, why something is happening. And all the research I kept doing was like, well, the why would be great to have, but I'm more interested in looking at the what. What's happening? What kind of impact can we have on real world outcomes outside of a lab setting, outside of a really controlled field setting even. And so that kind of feedback and reflection led me into the job that I have now, which is working with companies to run experiments or to apply behavioral insights even without an experiment to look at impact and postulate what the mechanism is. You certainly want a theoretical grounding, but not try to invent a new bias or anything like that.
That's interesting. I mean, I think it also is like resonates, I would imagine, with a lot of the folks in the corporate setting that you'd be talking with. Are not necessarily, they're excited about behavioral science, but not necessarily keen on like running a randomized control trial. So it's almost like you're kind of just selling them once on the idea of, you know, this is what behavioral science is. Here's the potential impact based on this mechanism that we can sort of, you're sort of saying reasonably assume applies in your case as well, but you don't have to actually then push them to, you know, randomize and develop like a sort of controlled experiment to test it in every case. Is that what you're saying?
I'd say that's part of what I'm saying. I think if we can do an experiment, that's great. So yeah, I guess I would say if there's a business challenge out there, let's say getting your employees to submit their expense reports on time, you can certainly look at the psychological literature and go run down several different types of mechanisms of action that you might be able to throw into an email, for instance, the different types of language you could use or framing you could use, incentive framing, all of that, social norms, all the very basic concepts that we all know and love and hear about all the time. So a company could be introduced to those ideas, those patterns, those psychological patterns and concepts that have been isolated as mechanisms in the lab or in a very controlled field setting, and they could just put them in the email reminders to get people to do their expense forms. I've worked with companies who have just taken that road, which is try to do better than what we think we're doing today based on what we know from the literature. The next step forward would be, let's actually try to rigorously test this, not just in a pre-post, but in an RCT. But what we're testing might not be, well, did the social norms do it? Or did the loss framing do it? Or did the timing of the email in the day when we think their attentional focus is higher do it? We don't care which of those did it. We just care that this new kitchen sink, so to speak, email had a better impact than the champion email, the incumbent email that we had already. And then the third group, and I think this is more rare in a corporate setting because it's not incentivized, is actually isolating the mechanism, would be running all the different variants of that messaging to isolate a social norm, to isolate a loss frame, to isolate maybe a combination of them, to go through all the different combinations of potential theoretical mechanisms and see which cell, or rather, which email of that design did best. Then you'd be isolating the mechanism. And even then, though, if those were the things we were drawing on, like loss aversion and social norms, there's no way that would get published because it's not really making a theoretical contribution, at least arguably, some would argue.
Yeah,
it'd have to be theoretically interesting. Like, oh, look, we saw, like I've seen this with doctors. Certain doctors respond to social norms, certain ones don't, based on their expertise level. Like, that's interesting. Like a limiting factor, a limiting condition of a theory is interesting, but if you're just replicating a theory with great impact, it's not interesting to be published.
Yeah, that's really interesting distinction between kind of the applied and, not that academia isn't applied, but sort of the, maybe corporate setting versus like the academic setting that I've never really, I live in the applied world myself. So it makes a lot of sense in hindsight, but I've never really thought of that difference there where it's a little more outcome driven. Like the primary thing we care about in a business setting is just getting an outcome. and how we get there. We'll do like what we call like kitchen sink tests, where we're just like, we're still using behavioral theories, but we're like, we're kind of in a rush. Like, this thing we're doing isn't working. Let's just throw everything that you have at it and just try to move the needle.
Yeah.
And we'll do that because people are in a rush, and like, we know have some things that might work, and we can accept that there's less precision in understanding what drove that. But in an academic setting, that would never fly, because that's just a waste of like research resources, because you're not actually answering anything. So that is a really interesting way to differentiate the two. I've never really thought about it that way, but that makes a lot more sense.
And I think the important thing is it's not like you can't have both. There are great studies out there that are published and unpublished that have both. It's hard to achieve both. I mean, the best way to get certainty in your independent variable, to know exactly what's causing a mechanism, is to have a perfectly controlled setting. And where the heck do you find that in the real world? Like, it's just so hard to control for every single potential confound. Whereas the dependent variable, really hard to get in a lab setting where you can have a lot of control. So there's some field settings where researchers have done an awesome job providing enough controls to have both certainty in the independent variable and, I say, relevance in the dependent variable. But it just takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time to gather that data. I mean, Eric, you run a bunch of these things. How long can it take to gather results in a real world setting? That doesn't really line up with the tenure clock always.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and like you said, it's not to say you can't do both. And like, we always push to do both. Like, we try to isolate stuff, but there's just, it depends on the scenario and what technology, what time is available to you.
Exactly.
Like, how urgent, like, and how it's always driven from the outcome regardless. And like, whenever we can isolate what drives that outcome, that's preferable, and that's what we shoot for. But sometimes you just have to make trade-offs for getting towards the outcome faster.
And I think now that you're speaking this out loud, I'm kind of thinking I missed a point of it, which is there are different things to look at. Would be, how clear is the mechanism of action? Like, is it not confounded? Are we sure that if we see an effect, it is caused by this part of the intervention? How relevant, how much do we really care about the outcome variable? Is it a proxy for behavior we care about? Like, is it people stating that they'll, buy more, or are they actually buying more? And then I think it's, for that mechanism piece and its interaction on the dependent variable, is it theoretically novel or interesting? Is it contributing to all of the books and journals that are out there, or is it just replicating it? Yeah. So I think you make a great point. Ideally, a experiment in a corporate environment would have both, know the mechanism and have a really relevant outcome variable, like a KPI that matters to the business, because the KPI will get you the quick wins or the credibility from people who care about metrics and don't care about the science. But the mechanism being isolated will help you with being able to have different interventions going forward. If you know what caused this behavior in this setting, I can better scale that in my organization. But at the end of the day, do I care that it was theoretically interesting based on the canon of social and cognitive psychology? I don't think that will ever be interesting to a corporation, nor should it be, unless somehow their mandate, maybe in Zarak's new job, unless their mandate changed to be, you have to, contribute to the canon.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I think the point that you just made was kind of the question that was in my mind of like, I can understand how if I'm the, corporation that you're consulting with, like, I don't necessarily care how you get to this outcome. If you can, throw whatever you got at it, and more people are filling out their expense reports on time, and that's what I needed, great. I don't really need to know more about it. But from your perspective, as the person, the institution who, and potentially in the case of myself as well, right? Like, we do want to replicate that in the future and understand like what the mechanism is. So what are the trade-offs that you make when you're thinking, do I try to understand the mechanism versus just like drive for the outcome? Is it just sort of like the, a resource constraint of like, do you have the time or the interest of the client that you're working with? Yeah.
I'd say if we go back to the three things of like knowing the mechanism, having a relevant outcome, and having it be theoretically interesting, I almost never have it be being theoretically interesting almost never enters my consideration set unless I'm actually doing research, which I don't do that much of. Or if I'm bringing an academic partner in, then I'm certainly looking for something theoretically interesting for him or her so that it's worth his or her time. Mm-hmm. But so I would leave the trade-offs between having a clear mechanism that's isolated and a good KPI. Well, I'd say the KPI matters the most generally because a lot of organizations I work with are doing this for the first time. And it's some team, some stakeholder, regardless of their level in the organization, that has decided this is a toolkit that I would like to bring in-house. Just like I brought data science in-house. I want to bring this into what I'm doing for a certain set of business challenges. But in order for this to grow long-term and meet my vision, I need other people to be convinced that it's valuable. Which means that the focus becomes a bit myopic in the near term on quick wins. So you throw that kitchen sink at it. Anything that you think will make, if we go back to emails, make that email more compelling and achieve the KPI that we wanted, and anything we can do to make that KPI actually be the metric that is important to the business. So for retention, for instance, I've worked on that metric a lot. That's a really tricky metric in certain businesses because the question is, well, what lag time for renewal do you care about? And are you going to wait 6 months for that? Or if you're thinking about like claims data, or people going to their wellness visits, you don't always have all of that data until 6 months later. But if you need the quick win up front, then use a proxy. So the focus is definitely on the dependent variable and trying to get a KPI that's immediate, even if it's not like one-to-one with the one you care about ultimately. Right. And secondary is the IV. But I'd say the big thing that I try to give everybody a caveat on is you can't get used to this. Sure, we will throw all our resources at getting you the outcome you want in this first portfolio of tests you're doing. But A, not all of those tests in that portfolio should work. I don't think it should. And B, you won't get, if we get a high hit rate, you're not going to replicate that. You should not expect that over time if you're actually doing this well. And so make sure that, yes, you're using this for buy-in, but don't get people addicted to seeing a high success rate. Unless you have a ton of low-hanging fruit across your organization forever, you won't get that. And then people will become disillusioned over time if you haven't sufficiently educated them on the discipline of running experiments and what it means to learn over time and the right type of failure. I know Erik and I were talking about this the other day.
Yeah, it's kind of like building bad habits. It's like, it's easy to find those little things, but eventually that's not going to sustain you. And you've got to commit to the whole process of trying to like really analyze the problem. It's so much more like when you're kind of building a testing culture, like the testing becomes the outcome and like, oh, we just have to like run a test and get that done. It's like, there's so much other work. It's like should all be partnered with, good data analytics, good data science, good like, behavioral understanding of what people are going through. Whoever the person is or the end user or whatever it is, like you can find those quick wins by throwing stuff at it, but eventually like the real promise of this is a repeatable process that you continue doing and continue learning. And like if you skip doing your homework, then you can ace the first test, but you're not gonna pass the class.
Yeah, you're getting your quick hit, but you're not adding to your knowledge base. You're meeting your KPI for the next 6 months, but next year you're screwed and you're back to the drawing board. So trying to, I think the best way around that, if you can do it, is do this idea of a portfolio approach. Not just do one quick test early on, but do 3 to 5 and ideally put in 2 that aren't stacked in the deck, so to speak. And commit yourself to following through with all of those and kind of almost hoping that some fail, and then after the fact promoting the failure. So I think there's a big thing between failure and process and failure and outcomes. I mean, this is like exactly what I talk to my MBA students about with decision making. What makes a good decision? Well, they would all agree at the end of the day, it's not the outcome. It's the process that got you there. If you would repeat this process over and over again, on net, you would get a good outcome. But each in specific time, you're not necessarily going to get a good outcome. So it's all about the process. Literally the exact same thing has to do with experiments. You have to do a good experimental process from defining the question you're answering, deciding on whether an experiment is actually the right method by which to answer that question. Is it really worth it to run an experiment? Are you actually going to do something different as a business depending on the results? That doesn't always happen. So to Erik's point, running an experiment for the sake of running an experiment is not necessarily a good use of your resources. And then going through the pre-experiment design with good decision science, going through the launch of the experiment itself with good decision science, like not letting yourself stop early, not being overly optimistic and extrapolating from early results, not being impatient or myopic on the short view. And then after the fact, not having confirmation bias and looking for results that aren't there. The idea of having good decisions and good decision process, I think, is synonymous with doing a good experiment. But corporations, and I get it, when you're doing something new, there's high stakes. A lot of people are watching you, and the currency that they trade in is not good process necessarily. It's good outcomes. Tells a better story.
Yeah, it's a difficult balance, but it's definitely a discipline thing. It's like you got to understand what the real value is of it. And sometimes it's just like a step-by-step process. Like you get people bought in the testing and you get some of those quick things, and then you got to get buy-in for the longer process. And it's like any kind of organizational or behavior change, really. Like sometimes
it's exactly
the initial thing.
Any new thing. And the funny thing is, as I'm talking through this, it's easy for me to be like, oh, big corporations, big organizations, they should fix, the way that their incentives are set up, to embrace failure and long-term change. But I have the same incentive. When I'm consulting to them and advising them, I want it to go well too. I know I will be judged more on the outcomes than on the process. So it's tricky for all of us, I think, that have more of that short-term relationship in the beginning, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So kind of shifting, we got on a little bit of a experimental tangent, which is always good. But
what's the hallmark of Action Design Radio podcast?
Yeah.
We're really just driving home. This is what it's really about, people.
Well, let me before you do it, let me say something on that. Like in the field of behavioral science, all these people who are interested in it, we're all interested in it, right? Like it's a trend, hopefully a persistent trend. But I think a lot of the attention is on these lists of concepts and patterns, heuristics and biases, stupid human mistakes, slip-ups, things that we do. But the real beauty of it, I think, is the science underneath. It's just it's just experimentation. It's just a scientific method. And I think there's not enough attention paid to trying to measure these things in life better. It doesn't even have to be with an RCT, just more rigor.
Yeah.
Do you find that
that was like the big thing I had to learn in getting into this. It's really a process, and it's not a bunch of concepts. Like concepts are helpful when they inform the process, but it's really a system that you apply. Yeah, go ahead, Zarak.
I was going to say, do you find that like when you start applying essentially like the scientific method to like this one piece of it, I feel like a lot of times like, behavioral stuff, it's like, it seems like it's a really discrete, like small, like, oh, we're just focusing on this one behavior for this one thing. Like you then realize, oh, like you kind of need to apply, scientific method, or at least like some kind of understanding of like cause and effect to like bigger pieces of just like the business itself. Like when you're working with folks, like to say like, yeah, okay, like you want, like we're working on this proxy here to change this thing, but like you haven't even connected those things yet. And how do you navigate that?
I mean, well, that's just operation. It's like the pipes aren't hooked up.
Right.
I mean, I think I would say that maybe I'm making this up, but like 20% of my job is like the list of concepts, workshops, getting people exciting, helping introduce them to some of these patterns to watch out for themselves and others and design around. And then like 80% of it is operational, or the process of experimenting, or the process of running qualitative research. Even if it's not quant research, you can still apply the scientific method and thinking about like, did we measure 100 times and cut once? Were we disciplined in making sure we ran a pilot first? Did we run a fake analysis and just see what results spit out? Did we make sure that the way that the call center is measuring affirmation is the same as the way we're measuring affirmation? Or is it actually slightly different variable? And oh crap, like we're screwed after we run the test because we just wasted all that test because the data wasn't hooked up. Are we defining what we're actually looking for? I've run qual research, like focus groups and interviews, where like for the salespeople, we'll try different sales aids, like different sales introductions, and we'll see what the participants or the respondents say or do. But before the person goes out there, we run a quick independent assessment so people don't talk to each other. They just write it down. Like, what are we actually testing right now, guys? What's your hypothesis? And then once we get alignment there, because usually there's heterogeneity, we say, okay, well, what will let you know what will confirm or disconfirm your hypothesis? Are you looking at body language? Are you looking at them saying something? Is it the answer to this question or that question? And which answer is it? Is there a range of answers? And again, huge heterogeneity. So just even thinking about defining your independent variable and dependent variable in advance of any research process is something that I think organizations should do. So to your point of like, do you find yourself applying the scientific method everywhere? Yeah, I love it. I wish I could go back and be a statistician, actually. I work with one on the side, and he's amazing. I feel like my brain grows every time I talk to him. I think all the decision stuff that I work on, all the experimenting, any research stuff, if I view it through the lens of statistics, I do it better. Just basic statistics, nothing hardcore, reliability and validity.
Yeah, same. I've totally thought about going back and doing like a statistics master's, but I'm not sure it's like worth all the time and investment now, but in the past it would have been for sure.
No, so. You and I can just do statistics therapy together.
Yeah, exactly. Study groups, yeah.
Exactly.
Statistics book club meets every Wednesday if anybody wants to join.
The cool thing, like a lot of the biases are cognitive. And they have to do with us doing statistics wrong in our head. Like, yeah,
exactly. Mental accounting is like statistics in a lot of ways. Yeah,
it's well, no, but like literally stuff. All the pieces out of representativeness, ignoring regression to the mean, overlooking base rates, extrapolating from too small of a sample. That's just science. That's just the scientific method, you know. So I wish that everybody interested in all these psychology biases would go and read a stats book. At least that's what I wish I was spending more of my time doing.
Yeah, it narrows down a lot of those. And I think a couple of points to that, and then I think this transitions nicely to our main topic of like corporate decision making, which is sort of what we're already talking about, in a roundabout way. But 2 points that kind of come to mind through kind of this last segment here is one is like thinking about like theory and how much the theory applies. Like I think in a applied setting, theory can sort of be multiple things. Like there's the core academic behavioral theory, but like you can think of it in a similar way in like an applied setting where like theory is just like what are the barriers that are preventing this thing from happening, and it's the same sort of research process. And you find like, oh, we have bad onboarding, and that leads to a lot of churn, and like then you can use behavioral, like the more traditional behavioral concepts, but like that's a theory in and of itself that's meaningful to your organization or the problem you're working on. Does that make sense?
I might call it, I would say I would only do one thing, and that's just maybe my vocabulary. I would call it a hypothesis.
Yeah, like that's your hypothesis, and that's like your gap you found or whatever that is, and then you fill that with other different ways. But it's like, it's similar to like when you read a lot of these, the academic studies, they sort of come out with these big, things like loss aversion and stuff, and like you're finding those similar things. You're finding those gaps in your own process and learning what fills up in a lot of ways.
Yes. Yeah, the big hypothesis recurring, actually, the theory. So I've seen several hypotheses validated or failed to be invalidated in corporate settings, which all roll up to being, and I apologize, I don't have the guy's name. Well, there's a quote from healthcare, and the name of the gentleman who generated this quote escapes me, but it's basically every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's like, right, that's right. The call center reps were incentivized on performance, so those who realized that they were in the control group or didn't like what they were doing and overheard some treatment language started doing it because they were pretty sure it was better. Oh, well, of course they were going to, like, no shit. Like, that's how the system was designed, so of course it's going to get those results. Yeah. That would be the theory that I think upholds in organizations.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of transitioning off that, we're already sort of talking about it in a lot of ways, but kind of the main topic I know that's been interesting to you a lot lately and outside of this is kind of like decision science in corporate research, especially, and like how people make decisions in corporations and how we can kind of like adjust that using this process and kind of, behavioral science theory and of course the process more so. So, and kind of think about that, like how would you kind of summarize what this sort of issue is, and how does corporate decision making differ much from just at the decision making an average person makes? Like I would say if there's like a bigger difference, it's like you're usually looking at a lot more inputs that might go into corporate decision making, where it's maybe more things like groupthink and more people collectively making decisions or a series of decisions that lead to an outcome. But how would you just kind of describe that issue and compare it to kind of the individual?
That's interesting contrast. as my gut response would say, there isn't a big difference between corporate decision making and personal decision making. But I think you're right. There are probably some systematic differences. One is the number of people that are generally involved or supposed to be involved. The other is the stakes put on a lot of the different research decisions that are made. I mean, I'm thinking decisions as in, how do we structure this focus group, or do we run an experiment, or do we launch this product? Big decisions, not should I send this email to Zarak, or should I pause until I'm not angry anymore and rewrite it? Right? Like that.
I'm tired of getting those emails, by the way. I should have told you earlier. Like, I'm sick of getting them. So
I find myself in that situation often. So I
would say fundamentally there's no difference, but structurally there is. And I think one of the biggest differences, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head right now, is that I think in a corporation, decisions are like official. Like, we're going to run this series of interviews with customers, and it's going to help us make a decision on how to repackage this product. And it's going to lead us to getting all these more sales. And like it makes it feel like the decision process and the research process is this beautifully baked product. I think for anyone outside of that organization, it must think and assume that this is this official baked process. But you go in there and you live it, and you're like, oh my God, we're all just making it up as we go.
Chaos, yeah.
Right? It's absolute chaos. It's like you said in your organization, you need results yesterday. We needed to launch the new packaging yesterday. The supplier's waiting with the goods, and like the longer they wait, we have to pay them in arrears, or I don't know. Like, there's this rushing, and we got to make it up as we go. And do you think 20 people is enough to interview, or 18 or 15? I don't know. Let's just go with, what this outsider has said, because at least they seem to know what they're doing. I mean, I think I think that it's the decision making at the end of the day is exactly the same as personal life, but you have this veneer and feeling like what you're doing should be fully baked and official and perfect, and it's just so far from it. Which is okay. I think that's totally okay.
But that's where you come in, is you can help find where it's maybe more efficient.
I mean, I'm making it up as I go too. That's also the dirty little secret. We all are.
I will say, I do think that there is a parallel with people's personal lives too. Like, thinking about like being a child and then growing up, you're
right.
like, wow, everyone's really got it figured out. They like know how it works. And then you're like, oh, I'm an adult. It's like, oh, I see how it works now. You just kind of, you sort of luck out most of the time, and you ask people for help, and
Yes, no, you're totally right. And you're like, oh, this is but it's like to be an adult. We're all making it up. But I feel like I still, even though I've experienced many, many great companies and teams, every time I join a new client on an engagement, I just assume they got it all figured out. And then I'm always like, oh my gosh, no, they don't. None of us do, which is kind of cool, because if they're also feeling that way, which often they are because they're under a lot of stress and they need to get stuff done and they're open to new ideas, we can then redesign it. We can actually make it into a process that's a little bit more disciplined, even a little bit, with low time commitment, low complication changes to the way they do things, the order in which they do things. It could be as simple as, hey guys, in this brainstorming session, why don't we do independent assessment? Everybody write something down and then talk. It takes 30 seconds. Not hard to do. Most people embrace it, and you get more ideas out of it.
Yeah, and I think maybe build on that. We've established that most of us don't really know what we're doing, and that even though things may look good on the outside, like there's still a lot of issues, and pretty much any organization has struggles with decision making,
including my own. And I have 2 people in it. You would not imagine. Like, my files aren't organized enough. My God, I hate QuickBooks. I hate it.
Sometimes I feel so ashamed when like there's just some part of my life that is just such a mess, and I'm just like, I'm like a behavioral science person. I feel like I should have figured out. Yeah,
hypocrites. I know. Anyway, sorry, I
interrupted. No, so perfect. But I mean, building on that, what are some common examples that maybe you see through your own work or through research, or like kind of some common biases or like decision making mistakes that you think bigger organizations tend to make? Or that might be the most common. And a lot of it might just have to do with the process of that rather than just one decision that they do. But
yeah, I think let's think about research processes generally, whether they be qualitative or quantitative, whether they be a randomized control test, or like I'm going to do some quick user testing in a room and just get some quick ideas. I'd say that the first, I mean, we kind of talked about it already, but it's like the goals aren't always clearly defined to everyone who needs to know them. And they aren't, and one quick way to change that is to have everybody involved in the research process, outside the room and inside the room, just write it down and measure the heterogeneity there. And then whoever is the key stakeholder, the one owning that process, can correct. And it can also see, hey, I guess I've been communicating it potentially in the wrong way, because I can see like 80% of the people kind of thought of it as we were measuring color as well as shape, and I really just wanted to measure shape. I'm making that up, obviously. But it can help even the leader or the person managing it know how they're communicating. So defining the goals, there can be heterogeneity there that goes kind of unspoken because of false consensus effect. We don't question each other. We kind of assume we're on the same page. Like Erik, you and I have talked about experiments a lot. We're on the same page. We have the same assumptions of how we should run it. Of course, Erik's a smart guy. Of course, he agrees with me. It's not even delusional. I think good about, I think well about him, right? So exactly. So you get that false consensus. And the same thing can happen with loosely constructed your independent and dependent variable. What intervention you're testing, whatever this research might be, whether it's a stimuli in a qualitative research, whether it's intervention in a quantitative research, it could be anything. There's not always agreement on the independent variable, again, generally based on false consensus effect, as well as the dependent variable. I think another thing that happens on the independent variable is that we don't always write down the business actions we're going to take based on what we see. Actually, that's a combination of independent and dependent. So saying, of all the different outcomes I could get based on these different stimuli I'm running, if I bucket them together in natural categories, what am I going to do in each of those states of the world? If retention looks like it's gone up by 0 to 10%, what am I going to do? If it goes up between 10.01 and 20%, what am I going to do? If it actually went down, what am I going to do? Defining all of that in advance and pointing to the business actions involved for you, for the person in marketing, for the person in ops, for the person in HR, is really quite important and can help you realize you haven't set up the qualitative or quantitative research correctly. So I've worked with one company doing an experiment, and it's an experiment on their product. So the results will impact claims that their PR department can make and marketing. It will result, the results will impact their innovation and R&D team. They may change the product based on the results. The results will change what their CEO is saying and doing at conferences. So there's a lot of different stakeholders who are going to use the results in different ways. So what we did for the test, my colleague and I, was have each of them write down the claims they wanted to make or the things they wanted to be able to do with the study if it went well in whatever terms that meant to them. And seeing all that actually helped us backwards induct the overlap what we should actually be testing as the changes in the product and what we should actually be measuring in the metrics. And we would have been measuring the wrong things for some of those people had we not done it. We would have been measuring only one part of the product and not another wraparound part of it had we not done that test. So it's not hard to do that exercise. It all comes back to independent assessment and framing a question correct, like in a clean way, so that it can then lead you to a better design of the research. But I don't think people put on the brakes. They're in such a rush to we talked about this, right? Quick wins. Get me my results quickly. That is the reality in which we all live. We don't realize it only takes a couple minute exercise to get to a better design where we're going to get what we want. So investing those 5 minutes now will save me quite a bit of time, money, and wasted resources later.
Do you see that, like, any growth or, like, maturity over time, like, over the duration of your engagements with companies where, like, now they've learned this, and so they, like, understand the importance, and you don't necessarily have to, you get to maybe change the percentage of your time. I know you said, like, kind of 80-20, like, operations versus, like, thinking about behavioral stuff. Does that change over time where, like, they mature in some ways on the operation side, and so you kind of pivot back more, slide back more towards behavioral?
I would say they do certainly grow over time. The determining factor there is if somebody feels like they own the process. So if you're running, especially I've seen this with qual research, there's a lot of different people in the room, different agencies, third parties in the room. There's no clear person who's supposed to say, okay, guys, we're going to stop and do a decision science exercise right now. I'm the only one who can be the geek and do that. Unless someone in the client team decides, no, this is part of my job description. I am in charge of making sure the process goes well. Or unless like the facilitator in that qualitative research decides that's part of the job he or she wants to incorporate, or what that's something that he or she believes is part of her job. But if there's no clear owner of that 5-minute exercise, then it doesn't change much. Now on the pure ops side, like fixing your data pipes, oh yeah. I mean, as soon as we figure something's going wrong, that at least enters the pipeline to be fixed, even if it doesn't get fixed right away.
Gotcha. And how much is your focus on like identifying that person? Is that at all? Oh, sorry, guys, got a little.
No, yeah, it's fine.
It's not. What's going on?
It's okay on my end. God's God.
Yeah,
North Carolina. Public violence.
So many emergencies.
Reminds me when I lived in Manhattan, and like every time I would talk on the phone with my parents, they'd be like I was just totally oblivious to it. But there was like every time we talked to you, there's a siren in the background. I just didn't even notice it anymore.
Yeah, that's a barbecue sauce delivery over here. Yeah, no, I was going to ask.
Oh, is that part of my? I think that's like a very good question, and that thought has never occurred to me until you just said it. And I think you're probably right. At least unspoken, it should be. If I really want organizations to grow and change and bring this in-house, which I think I would love them to do, it's another great toolkit for them to have. I should have a conversation with at least the main client counterpart team to say, how can we better incorporate that into your Did you like it? If you like this exercise, let's just spend 5 minutes now thinking ahead before we do the next research on how that's going to fit into your process. Is it going to be you, James, who, are incorporating it, or you, Jill, and when are you going to do it? And just having that pre-commitment, right? It's behavioral science for process, pre-commitment device. Where are you going to write it in? How's it going to be a default for what you do? I think it's a really good point. I should be thinking more about that.
Yeah, so much, like you just mentioned, it's the same sort of biases that just in any individual decision come up, but it's more applying it to a process when it comes down to it. It's like in thinking of like, decision science issues in companies, like there's not as much of like a big sexy answer of like, there's this thing we do wrong, we got to change it. It really comes down to like process and how you actually go about doing things. And, like very clear things. And you think these are the same sort of things that, we do in kind of our personal lives. Like we don't get very specific on our goals. We say like, oh, I want a fulfilling career that makes me a lot of money. Like, well, what does that mean? How do you quantify that? Like you can't just, it's a pretty vague like statement to make. But if you get really specific about that, like, oh, that means I want to make X amount per year. I want to have this amount of vacation. I want to have, be working in this industry. Then it makes it a lot easier to go through that. And like, that seems so obvious, but even in just the most standard corporate decisions or that we're doing, and again, it's because we're busy and we just default to what's easy and we default to the easiest path. Exactly. And that comes down to coming up with the process and also in the solutions. Like, a lot of what we try to do when we're trying to think about, in my job and come up with solutions and things to test and stuff like that is like get beyond the obvious and get outside of that stuff that comes to mind first. Cause like maybe there's low hanging fruit that makes it really obvious, but most likely the answers to your kind of problems or whatever the questions are you have are going to be beyond that first thought that comes to mind. It's like that availability bias kind of thing. Like you've got to always push yourself past that.
Shane Parrish had a good post on that last week. If you read his blog. Farnham Street. Yeah.
I do occasionally.
I am hooked on that now. I love it, and I do not get hooked on stuff easy. So
he has some very good behavioral science ones. Maybe we'll have to get him on the pod.
And it's like decision science. It's often like the statistical. I say stats. I say stats is a very broad term. He makes me feel like I'm thinking more cleanly, like a statistician, rather than a muddled human. Anyway, that's a. But I think. Process doesn't sell. Process does not sell. People don't. I don't usually get clients saying, "I'm going to make you a really cool process." That's no one likes to buy that. People buy results. So I think sometimes the way to make it compelling is to sort of I think what does sell is the funny story about your own biases, or like helping them see their own biases in a very humble way, because we all share them. So the story I love telling, I was just shocked when I did it, was in qual research, watching a series of interviews with doctors. And I had this hypothesis I wanted to test, based on behavioral theory. And the facilitator went in and had a way of testing it. And she did it. And the doctor did not do what I wanted him to do. The theory did not replicate in that instantiation, in that environment. And I leaned over to my client counterpart and I go, "Oh, that doc's just an outlier." Like, oh,
I hear the siren going off again.
Yeah, I know.
Bias alert.
That was me. I just did that, and I feel it with every research I run. Whenever there's a qual or quant test where I've thrown an idea into the pot, whether it be a perfect RCT or not, it happened all the time in qual. When my idea is on the table, I'm like, win, please, like, and I viscerally respond when it doesn't, which is most of the time. But like, it's part of the learning process, right? And so it's very humbling for me to experience it over and over again, because it reminds me that it's exactly how my clients are. We are all human. We all have confirmation bias, and it's why they need process and I need process to help us think more rationally and actually learn from the research we're trying to do.
One of the tips that we got several, months ago, we were chatting with Kelvin Kwong, and he talked about, like, basically they were running experiments, and one of the most important things for them was getting the cycle time down so that they could run more experiments. And an unintended consequence, but something that proved very useful, was that because they were able to run more, they became less invested, or like he became less invested personally in like a specific experiment. And so, like, if you're running one experiment and you've spent 6 months on it, like, you really want it to work.
Oh, yeah.
But if you've got like 5 or 8 going, and you're gonna, they all come back in a week, and 3 of them or 5 of them don't work, you're like, right.
Don't check your stocks every day. This is exactly why I suggest people do. I love that. Like, you have to do a portfolio. Never go in with one test. Well, that's probably too strong to say. Try not to go in with one test. Try to have a portfolio if you can, if you have the sample, or do it in different areas, because you will feel much less attached to each one and be less prone to the myopia and loss aversion and all the other biases that fall out of that for each experiment.
Yeah, and that's a good example for a lot of business decisions where, like we talked about before, thinking about statistics and probability. Like, the world is pretty much unpredictable and it's very random, and you can spend all the time you want trying to make the perfect decision. But no matter how much time you research that and prepare for that, like, you still might get it wrong, just because there's always going to be so much stuff that you're not aware of. So you're better off kind of doing things like experiments that hedge your bets a little bit, so that eventually you can do 20 things and one of them will work out and you'll get the result you want.
Absolutely.
And it's the same thing. And the one thing think about kind of decision science issues and kind of corporations and companies and people in general, is that we tend to kind of it's kind of overconfidence bias. It's that we think that if we do all this research, we'll have all this knowledge and we'll make the right decision. But thinking that in probabilities, it's like don't give yourself one shot to get it right. Give yourself 20 shots to get it right. And do a little bit of research on that, but, err on getting that real world feedback to figure out which thing works and which thing doesn't.
And I think everything we've been talking about, it's very easy for us to slip into the tool of experimentation. But like we began in the beginning talking about with process and decision science, you can apply that to anything repeatable, right? Like, you can have the portfolio effect whenever you have the luxury of many decisions over time. But there are some decisions that corporations are making when it's like one time. Like, do I merge with this company or not? Do I lay off half of my workforce or not? These are single one-time decisions. And yet, applying the same decision science principles to that decision, that process, that's what you need to do that. Even though you're not going to have multiple at-bats, making it, using independent assessment where appropriate, segregating the different components of the decision out rather than just making one big intuitive decision. Using rankings, not ratings where appropriate. All the things that we do to have better rational decisions on these portfolio effect times, you should use with the one-time decisions as well. The problem is it's very hard to abstract yourself away from the myopic attachment you have to that one decision.
Yeah.
how would you think about that for something that's like a one-off and you can't necessarily run a test? Like, how would you kind of apply that? So let's say like a merger, for example, or like a merger acquisition. Like, how would you think about that? I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but like a big one-time decision like that, like how would you think about it through this same sort of lens, knowing you can't necessarily get that result ahead of time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would think. So I have to give credit to Daniel Kahneman, Olivier Sibony, and Cass Sunstein, who are working on this idea. But I would do a couple of different things that they've talked about in past articles, and I'm sure future. The first thing is delay intuition. You don't allow yourself to get a gut. You try not to get a gut feeling about should I do this merger or not. That's not something you want early on in the process because, as you guys know, it's going to kind of create a filter through which you view the rest of that merger decision. You're going to look to confirm that first intuition. So try to abstract yourself away from that. The next thing is to break it down into the components of the decision. So the different attributes you should be considering about the merger. So are the company's financials solid? What's its culture like? Is it geographically positioned in a complementary region? All the different segregated components that you want you and your team to be thinking that should go into that final decision. And then each one of those you want to evaluate independently as using as objective data as possible. So like the geography one's really easy. That's an actual fact. So like have their list of geographies, your list of geographies, and like set a threshold of I don't want, more than 60% overlap or whatever it might be. And do that for each of the components as much as you can. Then you aggregate different people's results, maybe show distribution of their results across those attributes, and then you can kind of move towards a discussion about the overall evaluation. I mean, in general, you're basically trying to get humans to think like an algorithm. You imagine an algorithm.
You're making it like data-driven as much as possible.
Well, data-driven, but also making my brain function more like an algorithm. An algorithm has different covariates. X, Y, Z, whatever the different variables are. Each of those have a weighting. Could be positive or negative as well. Maybe they're also, joined together. And then there's an outcome. We humans tend to jump to the outcome. That's what we just tend to jump to intuition, to that overall evaluation. You're trying to get them to disaggregate each of the variables.
We fit the inputs to the outcome we've already committed to.
Exactly.
We're an algorithm, like an algorithm is so totally like independent of an outcome and only looks at the inputs to provide that. Yeah.
Yes. And so a lot of what this process does, and Daniel Kahneman and his colleagues talk about, is to increase reliability or reduce noise. It prevents unwanted variability from entering the different decision processes of you and of Zarak and of me, so that maybe we have some biases, but on aggregate, we're kind of moving together. And if we were to do it over and over again, we'd get the same answer. Reliability is unwanted variability. Like you want to get rid of, noise is unwanted variability. You want to get rid of it. And this process also ends up getting rid of some bias as well by making, like you said, it avoids the confirmation of reading the inputs back in. I don't know if that's clear, but I think the main gist is if you're making these one-off decisions, you've got to try and make yourself think like an algorithm.
Yeah, I think maybe even like, this, and I know I think this is building on the same research, but the Kahneman's example of like hiring people, which is an example I use a lot in like this decision-making stuff that, usually we just decide how to hire people based on who we like from interviews the most and not really assessing whether they're actually good at what we're hiring them to do. We kind of let those kind of less important inputs of them, we're hiring a developer, like, oh, they're a great interviewer, so they must be a good developer. It's like, well, it's not necessarily the case. But instead, like, write down those 5 traits that are really important to this person, important for this job, draft your questions according to that criteria, note those in like a numerical fashion, and then add up the score. And then you can still take into account like how much you get along with them and stuff, but at least you are, thinking like an algorithm a little bit more, where you're taking in these kind of like data inputs first before you get swayed by the emotion and things like that.
You can kind of relate that, and maybe I'm extrapolating too much, to the decision science we we're just talking about, is write down all the things that are important for you as outputs to this research, and then you should backwards induct the research design. Rather than just running the research design hoping to confirm what you already think, write down all the things that could be true and that are important to you that the business action you to take, and then backwards induct the research process. That's the same way you should backwards induct your decision process.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I think on some of the decisions that are like that rely on such subjective like evaluations of things, it can be kind of like more difficult in practice. I mean, like, so the example of hiring people, right? So we've done this before where and part of it is like, I think, reducing noise. I don't necessarily know that I would have known to call it that at the time, but it's basically like, okay, everyone like go through like, here's sort of like the things that we're looking for in the candidate. Here are all the different candidates. Go through like kind of rate them on these different things or sort of your overall impression and, make some notes. Everyone does this independently. We get together, talk through, and you see like vastly different rankings for things, right? And sometimes it's because somebody was weighting one little piece a lot higher than another, or sometimes it's because something was difficult to, evaluate in the first place. But so what I've done in the past is, we do this. I've done this independent evaluation ranking, come together. Everyone kind of talks through that. We essentially do another ranking as a group, kind of, and it's usually, these things kind of move around a little bit, and then we look sort of just at like what the numbers produced, and then just essentially do like a sanity check. Like, okay, does this make sense? Like, does this, like, we have this person ranked 4 things higher than another person. Like, does that like actually make sense now that we've all kind of talked about this? I feel like so I read an article that you wrote a while ago about noise and bias. And one of the things that was like, I agreed with like that, there's like so much evidence behind like, algorithms doing things better than people. But I think a lot of times, especially in a corporate setting, people want to have a number because it makes them feel more comfortable making a decision. But the number, it's only there to make somebody comfortable, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's sort of like, oh yeah, well, we did the ranking and like this person got like a 34.33. It's like, okay, that number doesn't sound like it makes any sense. Like, where did that come from? And like, is that like, how did you make this like a cutoff or something? So one of the questions that I had after reading that was, like, how do you kind of judge or account for the quality of like the inputs or the variables that you're looking at if you're trying to sort of like either act like an algorithm or actually just build an algorithm?
Pre-commitment or pre-definition. Like months before your recruiting cycle, you should be writing down all of those attributes, and you should be clearly defining the response scales. I think, and I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit on my end briefly, so I apologize if you said this, but one of the biggest things I find noise creeps in on is not just really in like the inputs you're paying attention to, because you can kind of control that. Like, you're only going to look at the resume. You're only going to evaluate this question, and they're out of the room, There's a lot of noise in translating the scale. So on a scale of 1 to 7, a 5 means something very different to you than it does to me.
Totally.
So aggregating our results is stupid. Well, not stupid. So that's too strong, but like is dangerous. Yeah. Because you're integrating noise in translation. There's a great article by Danny Kahneman and Cass Sunstein way back when on jury decision making, where you see people actually generally agreeing on like level of severity of these crimes that they're judging. But when it comes to translating that to a dollar figure of like punitive damages, wildly different by orders of magnitude. So on something even more innocuous like the Likert scale, you're going to get a lot of variability. So it's okay to maybe use a Likert scale within subjects. So tracking Zarak over time, you're probably going to have a stable interpretation of a 5 now and tomorrow and a week from now. But you and I might differ. So can you switch that rating scale into a ranking scale or a case scale even? Give me, for instance, if we're going to recruiting, list 5 people who already work at the company, maybe some who got fired, but that we all know. Erik, you and I all know these people. We've worked with these people. Rank them on a certain set of attributes. For instance, ability to run a data analysis, let's say, defined more discreetly than that. You could create a ranking of those that I think the 3 of us would generally agree on if we've worked with these people. We might debate a little bit, but we'd come to an agreement, and that becomes our scale. It's a case scale. Then when you see a new candidate, Erik interviews that candidate, and you interview that candidate, and I interview that candidate, we should have pretty good agreement on where to place that candidate on the scale if our interview questions are all about data analysis. And then we reduce noise in interpretation of where that person lies. Or you can merely just rank them against other candidates on that attribute if we've all interviewed that same candidate on the same questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's something I hadn't even thought about as much before is how much, even when you try to get sort of, more data-driven, for lack of a better word, on decisions like that, like you could still mess up those scales just because people think totally differently. So like, I think the dollar amount is a really good example of that because like that makes you extrapolate it beyond like, 5 is good. I know a 5 is good, but what does good mean to you? Like, are we all in agreement of what good means?
Does it mean promote you?
Yeah.
What level does it mean you should be brought in? Associate, senior associate, principal?
Yeah, exactly. And I think like I've noticed that like in developing experiments and stuff like that is that like you can decide on an outcome like, we want like I think a 5% improvement sounds good, but like, okay, what does that mean in like a dollar amount to you? Like, 5% means, X amount of dollars. And it's like, that's not going to be worth it to corporate or whatever. Like, like just changing that. And I've had this a lot, like you can read a lot of these kind of like market examples of A/B tests and like, 30% uplift and stuff like that. And it's like, a percentage doesn't really mean anything for a business. It's like you're not going to go to your CEO and be like, hey, we had a 30% lift in opens. Like, and he's going to want to know like, what does that mean in like dollars or some other important metric. So it's always important to go, it's again, going beyond the obvious. There's always the easy thing to measure. And then there's like extrapolating that to like really define what that means. Yeah.
In business outcomes.
Yeah.
In the language, always translate to the language of the stakeholders. And that might be 5 different languages then.
For sure. And then that's what you got to figure out ahead of time is what's that noise. So much noise to take care of. It's a noisy, it's a noisy world out there.
It's an easier problem though than bias because you can actually measure its reduction. You don't need to know the truth to measure noise. You just need to know that Erik is different than Zarak, or Zarak today is different than Zarak tomorrow. I can measure that without even knowing that what he did was right. Whereas to measure bias, I need to know the true mean, and I need to know the difference of our average behavior against that true mean. But that is not always possible in business or in life.
Yeah. Right.
And I think that's a point. There's always a level of uncertainty in almost everything. Like, we can't always isolate everything, but we can make it a lot better, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know that we're getting kind of close to a time here, but I just wanted to throw out a hypothetical for you, which is, say, hypothetically, you're a person who's in a new role at a corporation applying behavioral science.
Purely hypothetical.
Hypothetically.
It's hypothetical.
Not like anyone on this call is doing that.
Not at all.
Right. There's probably thousands of action designers out there who are in this position. I'm asking on their behalf.
Oh, you're so charitable.
You're doing it for the good of all action designers out there.
That's right.
God's work.
Yeah. We've talked through a lot of like great, tips and some of the things that you've worked through. Is there anything that you kind of would add to that we haven't gotten to yet that you think is just really valuable in terms of thinking about applying this stuff in a corporate setting?
So I would reiterate one thing and I'll introduce one new thing. And I promise to be more brief than I usually am. First, be aware of your own confirmation bias. I love that bias. It haunts me every waking second.
Oh yeah.
And if your goal is to do research, which broadly construed, that's a big part of behavioral science, you need to be just as aware of your own confirmation bias as that of others, and be excited about disconfirming your beliefs. So that's a philosophical note. The more practical note is make friends. Someone was asking me recently about bringing someone in-house. I'm helping a company build another team in-house, and we're talking about qualities to recruit on. And for that environment, it'll vary. I basically said, you don't want them to be doing bullshit behavioral science, because there's a lot of that out there. It's very easy to dilute this stuff into like the list of the top 10 biases. That's right. Not. This whole discussion was about the science of behavioral science. We need to have more of that talk. So they need to recruit on that. And then this thing is they need to recruit on interpersonal skills. Often when you're building a team in-house, or even you're someone like me just doing a project, you absolutely need to make friends with as many people as possible. Because to run a research process, to introduce a new idea, even if you're not doing research on it, you got to have buy-in from the marketing team, from the ops team, from the user design team, from the brand team, from the product team, from HR, from compliance, from God knows too many people. So if you don't have strong interpersonal skills, it's going to be a challenge. So find a way to make friends, give before you get, appreciate other people. You are not the smartest person in the room. Just because you might know behavioral science, you definitely don't know that company. So be humble, make friends. If you can't do that, it'll be really hard to bring it into the company, and there will be organ rejection.
That's a good point. I think that also goes back to a point you just made about always like speaking in the language of the stakeholder or the person. Is that like, I know for myself, like if I'm working on a project, like there will be 4 different stakeholders and they all kind of speak a different language and have different things that maybe there's one unifying goal, but there's all these other things that they care about. And like, if you want to get people to commit to this and do something, because, in an ideal world, this is just part of what we do. This is how we run tests, we run this decision-making process. In the real world, it's really hard to get people to do this, and it takes a long time for it to be just a habit in what we do. So in the meantime, if you want to get people to do that, it has to speak to their individual goals, whatever that is. And like maybe it's as simple as like they just want recognition from their boss or whatever like that, or they just want to get promoted or something like that. Like everybody has all these different competing motivations to do this sort of thing. And if you want to drive organizational change and get this type of stuff done, like you have to understand that and be keen to that and have them trust you to deliver that.
Yeah. Every system is designed to get the results it gets. So you got to conform to that system, at least in the short run, so that it's kind of in your benefit. And then eventually change the system.
Yep.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
All right. Well, we're kind of running up on time here. We covered a lot of ground there. I think, we had talked before. We had talked about a few different topics, and I think it's up to you, but you're definitely welcome back to discuss more of these topics. There's a lot more we can dive into.
This is the stuff that I like thinking about now. I know when we first spoke, we were talking about like general choice architecture and behavior change, and I mean that's interesting. It is a lot of what I do, but this is the stuff that I geek out on, and that I wish I had more venues to share and get other people excited about. So thank you for letting me geek out a little bit on this.
Of course.
You're welcome anytime.
A major geek out session. And really, this is the type of stuff, like we talked about, it's easy to talk about choice architecture, top 10 biases. This is the harder stuff to this is what the nitty gritty is. And, if you are really interested in, I guess that sort of extends to, we usually tend to like to close out with saying, what advice would you give to people getting in the field? I think we've kind of already covered a lot of that in the previous question, but
read a stats book.
Yeah, read a stats book. But, this type of stuff, like if all the stuff we talked about for the last hour isn't that interesting to you, then like this might not be the right field, because this is actually what it is.
No, that's great. It's disconfirming evidence for some people.
Exactly.
Yes, absolutely.
So kind of covered that. I'd say summarize, is there anything particularly interesting you're working on that you would like to share? Which, how should people get a hold of you or follow your work? Things like that.
Let's see. I'm trying to write and speak more this year, so hopefully I'll be writing more articles. I've got an article coming out in People Science.
As do
plug for Zarak's new job. So I'm excited when that launches. It's a serious piece, so I don't do serious well, but yeah. So I guess I'm trying to write more. So that's exciting for me. I haven't spent a lot of time writing and thinking deeply outside of executing work. So that's and a lot of it's on experimentation and decision science and everything we've been talking about now. So if anyone wants to talk more about that, I'm happy to. In terms of project work, I'm excited about. I have a couple projects coming up where I'm helping actually a very small team think about how to redesign their process in trading decision making. So I don't know how to trade stocks, and no one let me do that. I will lose your money. But this is a very self-aware team who recognizes a couple of use cases of biases creeping into their decisions, and they want to remediate it with simple environmental design. So I'm excited to help them out with that. And then I have another company that's interested in overhauling how they do market research, which is very exciting for me because it's all about process.
The magic word.
So yay
process.
Yay to those companies. I'm their biggest fan.
Well, that's awesome. You're also obviously always welcome to speak at Action Design. So,
coming
as
to
you're
an
traveling
Action
around.
Design city near you.
That's right. Yeah.
You guys are too sweet. Well, thank you for the time and the great questions. Is really you both, I think, gave me some ideas I hadn't been thinking about before. And for instance, I have to find people to inherit the process, or else there's no point in doing it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, this is a good conversation. I feel like I'm regretting right now we're recording it so late, because now I feel like I'm all hyped up and I want to really take advantage of all this stuff that's like in my brain right now, and I might need to stay up another 2 or 3 hours to do it. But
just good reason, Peter. Re-listen to the podcast later.
Yeah,
you can edit the podcast and post it, Erik.
That's a great idea. I'll transcribe it. That'll make me go through it.
God.
Actually, no, that sounds, as much as I want to.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah, transcribe is not my thing. I was always a really bad note taker.
Well, you should also why don't you design a process for transcribing it such that you reduce the errors in the transcription process, like pre-commit. Do some good decision science on when that would be. We'll
record a follow-up podcast to share my findings. Commitment device. Everyone just unsubscribe, just thinking about that.
Everyone just unsubscribe right now because we're not even covering content anymore. They're like, all right, guys, y'all are going way too long here.
That's what you signed up for, so whether you know it or not. So, all right, well, I think any other parting thoughts here?
No, good luck on the job, Zarak. We're excited to see what you do with it. Don't let us down.
Thank you. I won't. I'll pre-commit. I won't.
Yeah. Make it specific, though.
Cool. Well, this is really fun.
Well, yeah, thanks again.
I think we're set to go. I'll let Zarak get back to the barbecue truck that just arrived or whatever it was. And,
all right.
That's right. Urgency. We got a barbecue emergency here.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Erik Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available for download on SoundCloud, YouTube, and iTunes. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once more, that is action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States, plus Toronto. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.